Welcome to another edition of Working with Gen Z. Friends, we've often said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, where is the first touch point where an employee can experience touch the culture? Perhaps in the recruitment process when he or she's trying to get and find out about the company, but assuming that they've made it and they're joining the company, when is the next time when they can actually experience the culture? And onboarding can be a really serious experience, which can kind of determine how the employee is going to look at the employer. Now, traditionally, onboarding is more about perhaps compliance, paperwork, but if you think about from the Gen Z's perspective, they're coming in with a lot of enthusiasm and really kind of heightened expectation of purpose, growth, career, and so on. So, what can companies do to really ensure that that experience is becoming one that's very memorable? And research has actually shown that onboarding, if done correctly, increases confidence, increases engagement, and increases retention. But how do you go about designing a good onboarding experience? And to help us with that is just my guest, and I'm delighted that we'll make this happen. So, welcome to the show, Krissa. I have Krissa for us, joining all the way from New York, and it's morning for you. So, Krissa, good morning and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, Krissa. So, we're going to talk about what kind of things that companies do, what do should avoid, what are some of the best practices, and why does onboarding matter? So we'll get into all of that in a bit. But before we do, as always, we want to let our viewers and our listeners to know a little bit about the guest. So I'm going to request if you can just tell us a little bit about your background, your backstory, and the experience of the work that you've done.
Sure, absolutely. So I started off my career in retail, marketing, branding, consumer experience, store design, visual merchandising. I sort of kind of ran the gamut. I was one of these people that had breadth of career and role very early on. And I was also a very young leader. So I've been on the side of being the person onboarded, drinking from the fire hose, not really understanding what the culture was like and having to work with people who were older than me and had different styles of working, even though I'm a millennial and not a Gen Zer. So I sort of have the firsthand experience of what it's like to be onboarded and not onboarded, actually, on the other side. But since my career in retail, I have switched to become a coach. Along the way, when I was growing in my career, I had been introduced to coaching as a way to help me develop. And at first, that became sort of like a side passion for me. And then after a few years, it became my full-time profession. I've now been a coach for almost 20 years, which is crazy to say that number out loud. It's like insane. But in the coaching, I've also started to work with clients at a more consulting basis. So I do fractional C-suite work. That merges my previous experience in leading teams inside of organizations and helping people scale up operations. So I do fractional C-suite work from interim CEO to fractional COO, as well as executive coaching and learning and development inside of companies. So I work with organizations and helping them structure their L&D programs and or their culture programs, as well as helping them think through how to recruit and retain talent appropriately for the particular business. So that's me.
All right. Well, fabulous. It's fascinating and very impressive. So I'm very happy, Krista, this is working. And I'm going to dive right in. And as you rightly said, onboarding from your career and now even as you talk to executives, perhaps when they think about the employees they're bringing on board, right? What do they see and, where has that evolved? So we'll kind of talk through some of that. So let's start with the basics, I suppose. The onboarding spectrum, right? First of all, just to lay the basics, right? Why does onboarding matter, right? I mean, it's saying the obvious, but just let's talk to that.
Well, separate from the Gen Z conversation, onboarding matters because it sets the tone for the cultural experience that people are going to have with the company. And so, as I mentioned, my background is in branding and marketing, and that's about the external experience of the brand. And so how someone interacts with the tone, the feel, the energy, the materials of your brand determines their experience and how loyal they're going to be to it, or how they view it in their mind, how well they treat it, right? And so an onboarding experience is the first internal experience of the brand, i.e. the culture. And so it doesn't really matter which population we're talking about, making sure that that is thought out and that there is some level of quote unquote branding associated with it is very important, so that people understand how they fit inside the organization. So we can dovetail this to like, is this a place where I belong? But also, how do I hold this organization? Am I going to treat it like it's a place that's very special to me? Or am I going to treat it like a place that's a more transactional sort of relationship where I just go do my thing and then I go home?
Sure. So, Krista, what have you seen? I think we're gonna kind of peel onboarding step by step, but what's the spectrum like? Have you seen companies, and now perhaps even in the Gen Z context, like, um, are they done? If they're done in groups, what happens versus, let's say, if you're getting people on a rolling basis, what happens, right? Because when I say in groups, typically many companies will have, like, let's say management training programs, right? Or they have an internship and they're trying to kind of get someone on permanently, right? So there's the individual versus sort of the group experience, right? And what are you seeing, right? And how do you go about tailoring if the two do exist?
Hmm. So I'm going to start off by talking about the different types of organizations because I see different trends and different types. So for the mid-sized companies, they usually are the ones that are hiring a lot of Gen Zs because their budgets are a little bit different. They typically have business models where they have more senior anchor positions, but they're filling the kind of grunt work positions or like even the more middle management positions with younger people because of the way the revenue models are structured and their organizational models are structured. So in those companies, what I notice is that there isn't really an emphasis on onboarding people in terms of the culture in the company. It's more an emphasis on onboarding as it pertains to the task and the function. And the problem with that as it pertains to Gen Zs is Gen Zs don't really care about their task in the best of ways. They really care about purpose and longevity and values. So when these mid-sized companies, and this can run the gamut, sometimes a mid-sized company might be a very low volume organization that has a lot of people because it's a high service organization. And so culture and the relationship dynamics inside the organization matter. Or it could be a company that's more of a product company and it's less people, but people are working remotely and in a more hybrid situation, and then they're feeling out of touch of the general culture. So the first piece is really thinking through, if you are a mid-sized company, making sure that you're slowing it down and caring about doing the culture of the organization. What the larger companies do well is that they have a legacy and they really articulate the legacy of the organization, the history of it to its new populations. And the ones that are newer startups, again, mid-sized companies, founder, led organizations don't really focus on that. They focus on the what. So as much as companies can really start to slow it down and incorporate the legacy and the why, that makes the biggest difference inside of onboarding people in general, but specifically Gen Zs. The other thing that I noticed to your question is that it really depends on the hiring cycles. So sometimes companies are bringing on multiple cohorts of people at one time, in which case then it becomes more programmatic. And that tends to actually create some more cohesion with the people that are being brought on board. And it certainly creates a sense of community, which is very important for Gen Zs. But for the companies who are just bringing on one-off hires or hiring maybe one person in finance and another person in marketing, then there is some like breakdown. So there isn't that like community. And so part of what I think is really important is starting the onboarding process before the people start. And what I mean by this is actually thinking through, like, how do we start to introduce new colleagues to each other? How do we start to sort of like do a marketing campaign, if you will? Again, I always look at something from a marketing perspective, just the way my brain works, but almost like a drip campaign before the employees start coming into the onboarding process, that they feel connected to the people that they'll be working with and the company that they're going to be showing up to day to day.
Yeah. So, what have you seen? Do you sense that does that even kind of get advertised in some ways if they're thinking, and if a candidate is almost sort of going to make it to the final stage, or he or she has been there. So do you start almost, from the employer's perspective that, look, I found the right person, and our onboarding is like this very unique, fabulous way to get to know the company and meet the people. What have you seen, or is it just that when you get that offer letter and then you get the dates and the time and the location, and to say that, okay, this is where I have to show up, and so yeah, what have you seen?
It's interesting because since we've all kind of gone back to work, I would say 2022 to now, it's been a lot of upheaval in how we do this. And many learning and development departments and HR teams have really struggled as to how to figure out the right type of onboarding for their company. So what I will say to this is, what I've seen is people actually taking this a little bit more seriously and thinking through it, because we've gone through the cycles of resignations and like the economic ups and downs, the AI, all the things we've experienced in the last only 5 years, but like it's already been 5 years. So I think what I've been seeing is people are actually living less in a this is how we onboard, and they're becoming more responsive and reactive based on what's happening in the moment. So onboarding cycles and ways of approaching onboarding are in a continuous state of improvement, which is a good thing. That's one of the kind of takeaways I'd like to give people from this podcast, is to say that with Gen Zs, they really do care about continuous improvement. And they want continuous feedback loops. Like, they're not waiting around for my performance review. They want to know how they're doing today. They need the positive recognition pretty frequently, but they also need to know what wasn't working so they can course correct it, so they're not feeling mystified when feedback comes later. So to that point, that same philosophy of continuous improvement and continuous feedback looping is really important as we're like crafting onboarding programs. So that's what I've seen a lot of, is people being intentional about them, and then looking at how it worked, measuring progress, and making adjustments as they need to.
Yeah, and you make a good point. I think post 22, which brings up one other question: that do you see, considering so much of us now either are doing hybrid or have an expectation of a hybrid form of working, does the onboarding even get done hybrid? So that's one. And the second is that what have you seen as kind of the range of the onboarding induction? In other words, does it range from, like in some companies, I mean, it's pretty elaborate, like 2, 3, 4 days, whatever, and in some companies it could be a half a day or a day, so what's the duration as well, like from as little to the grand on the other side? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I think if we're talking specifically about Gen Zs, the more hybrid you can actually make the onboarding, the better it is for their experience, because they are of the digital age, as we know. They're used to doing things online. They grew up going to school during COVID, so they may have graduated college or have like done most of their high school via an online platform. So like using that medium is really important for them. It's how they're comfortable learning. And we would perceive it as like them hiding behind the screen, but it actually is where they're able to do like the best of their work. It's almost like their learning style, and understanding that allows you to craft the onboarding in a way that's more useful for them and will probably stick more, because being with people is a very different skill set in terms of onboarding. And that is not, from a Gen Z perspective, that is not when they're like learning. That is when they are engaging. Whereas you and I, we may have gone to like workshops or team building sessions, and that's when we learn. That's where we like got information and we downloaded it. So for them, they separate those two things out. They're learning behind the screen, and then they're interacting in person. So thinking about creating onboarding moments where it's balanced in that way, I think, is useful for the Gen Z population. But also, I will say that for everybody else that lived through COVID, I think we've all gotten into the habit is I work better from home. Like we can be more productive from home. We can sit in our own world, take out the distractions, and then I can go to work, to the office, to have the meetings and collaborate. But my real deep thinking is going to happen when I'm home. Many of us have sort of shifted to that model. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind as we are on board with people. As it pertains to like the gamut, there is a whole gamut. It's true. And it's really quite fascinating to see. And, the companies that have the money and the time and the bigger organizations do have more of like a really kind of beautiful arc to their onboarding. But that doesn't have to be the case. Like every organization can have an arc. It might be a smaller arc for you. It may not be as elaborate, but you can have an arc. And I think it's actually important that they all do have an arc. So for me, whenever I'm working with an organization, I like to establish a couple of milestones in terms of the onboarding process. The first one is making sure that the employee has a clear point of contact. This is specifically very hard inside smaller organizations or mid-sized companies, and sometimes can even get a little bit kind of muddled in larger organizations, but who is the person that's ushering them and passing them off to their team? And then this person can also be the go-to. It may be someone it's typically someone in HR. It might be somebody in recruitment. It might be somebody in learning and development. It might be their HR business partner. But who is the person that's really sort of ushering them along, making sure that they're all set up and comfortable, almost like the ambassador of the brand. So that's very important to have in every organization. And also, it can become very confusing when a person has been going through an interview process, and then it's like, okay, well, here's the hiring manager, and now you met 8 other people, but now you're going to go back to the hiring manager, but that's not the person you're working with day to day. You're going to be working with this team. It's like, what's going on here? So making sure there's some continuity at the very beginning is important, and that there was checkpoints along the arc with that person to support their development. The other thing is I really do believe in doing something before people start. For some companies, that might be just sending them a great brand guide about what the organization is and what they do, links to websites, maybe reading some materials or media press releases about the organization, and that could be sufficient for a small company. For other organizations, it's sending them handbooks and looking at company videos. It's something that introduces them to the culture and like lands them in the right mindset prior to showing up for work. And then, as I said earlier, having a schedule, truly an outline of what they're going to be learning and when they're going to be learning it. Again, it depends on your organization, is vital to making sure people know where they're going. Specifically for Gen Zs, they need to know the roadmap. If they do not know the roadmap, they become very frustrated and honestly very disengaged, because if they're used to being able to access information, like I want to know what happened on this date 10 years ago, and they can find it right away. So if those kinds of information is now at their fingertips, it becomes overwhelming for them. So that's very important to make sure you're outlining. And then the last piece is making sure that you do put in place a 30, 60, 90 as part of the onboarding process. And I don't just mean from a performance improvement plan, which is important. So the performance side matters to make sure people are doing what they need to do. But it's thinking through, like, at 30 days, how should they have engaged with the company leaders, with the culture, with important stakeholders or clients, and the same checkpoints for 60 and 90, so they feel that they've been surrounded by the culture.
No, excellent. I think you make a good point about hybrid. They work efficiently sort of from home, but yet when you're in person, that's the engagement piece. So, Krista, what is, from your point of view, what would you say is sort of like the must-have? I mean, you outlined it, some of it now, on the previous question, but let's say you're doing a sort of a physical, get together on a site and onboarding, right? What is sort of the must-have that we must, or a company should try and do? So, in other words, obviously, I know some basic history of the company, but should the focus be, okay, the history, the products, etc., the location, we cover all of that, the IT, etc., versus getting a few mentors to talk about their own journey, or maybe even ambassadors, like maybe the previous cohort which was there a year ago, what would you say is the must-have, and what kind of the optional? Because at the end of the day, if you want to make it an enriching experience, right? What can we do? I mean, in some companies, you could have some team building exercises later on and whatnot, right? Or in the evening, networking and whatnot. But just from your point of view, like, are there some things that there's absolutely must have, and what can we do to enhance that experience beyond just like an information download?
Yes. I would really recommend not doing an information download first and foremost.
Okay.
It's too much for people. It's always been too much for people. I think those of us who sort of grew up in different decades and worked in different decades are sort of like accepting of it and okay drinking from the fire hose. Gen Zs are not comfortable with that, so I don't recommend it. I think it's about putting the information in bite-sized, digestible, relevant pieces. That's why having the arc of onboarding is really important. So that would be the number one must-have is the arc. The other piece is making sure that there is clarity of purpose. Gen Z really cares about values and they want to align themselves with companies that have certain values. And then the last piece is, oh, I'm going to insert like a bullet point to that. Also being clear about what progression looks like. It doesn't work for them to not understand when I'm doing what I'm doing and how do I grow? How do I make more money? How do I add more value? They're just not willing to stick around and not understand how they're going to ascend inside of an organization. Again, it's a little bit because they are of the generation where things sort of kind of happen in an instant gratification way, but they're also of the generation where like they are super resourceful and nimble. And so therefore they see themselves as being able to adapt and move quickly because they can learn pretty fast. And so we have to figure out a way to like close the gap between like their skills and like what their willingness is, and then also develop them from a soft skill perspective. So that's another absolute must have is making sure in the onboarding process, we're clear that we have to develop soft skills and it's not just about training them on their job. The truth is they could probably do their job with their eyes closed, honestly. Like they're not, it's unless it's a very technical or a job that requires a lot of just understanding how mechanics work with clients. Most Gen Zs can show up and pretty much deliver on the actual job description. It's really more like teaching, providing onboarding for the soft skills required to excel inside that organization and then also in general in their careers. So that has to be a part of the onboarding. And most companies get really frustrated and they start to cycle around these sort of like moments of conflict with Gen Z where we feel that they're being entitled or that they're being lazy or that they just like don't communicate well because they're only on Slack. They won't have the face-to-face meetings. They won't do the difficult conversations. So we start to have all these complaints, but the challenge is like the focus for the company is now shifting from training them on skills to training them on these more softer sort of relational skills. So that those are the must-haves I see that are really important.
Yeah. No, excellent. I think very good points. So I guess if we go on the other end of the spectrum, right? What have you seen? Like, what are some of the things to avoid? Like you mentioned, the information download, etc. But have you seen also, Krista, like perhaps let's say, I mean, I don't know. I think again we be careful about any stereotypes, but I think, and we mentioned this in the beginning that okay, if the onboarding experience doesn't kind of live up, does that quickly kind of disengage or demotivate or even in the worst case scenario kind of an exit happening very soon. So what must you avoid so it's sort of like no surprises and because I think this is the one generation which really expects and wants transparency unlike perhaps from the previous generation, they're quite happy to like just be thankful, like, hey, I want to go to a job, I got a good job, and I'm gonna take it as it comes. So what have you seen? Like, what kind of things that companies the mistakes that they should be careful about? And then maybe have you seen any stories, or do you see that okay, maybe if this didn't land it the way I wanted, that's just result into more attrition right at the beginning.
Yes. So, I'm a coach first and foremost as it pertains to this profession. So first I'm a marketer, then I'm a coach, then I'm a consultant. And so from a coaching perspective, I say this because what you believe, the biases that you have, the tip of butts that are happening are going to influence how you do what you do. And so the number one thing I think is important for companies is to actually check their beliefs and philosophies around Gen Zs. And this happens in rooms all the time, right? Large organizations, small organizations, we always talk about our people. We talk about our staff. We are assessing them. We're dealing with conflicts with them. But watching how you're speaking about them. is really important, because if we're having any negative dialogue, negative beliefs about it, that's going to influence the way we structure the programs and the way that we show up, and people will feel it, right? Energy is inclusive. Your thoughts are not just in your head. People can feel them, they can sense them, and then that equals a reaction. So being really mindful about how we are viewing those populations as leaders, HR professionals, founders, interviewers, etc., is very important. And I don't want to brush over that. It's actually like the most foundational piece. So being honest about it and being willing to sort of be curious about this population and learn more about them. And for some of us, people are having children later in life. Some people are not. Like, people are not having as many kids. And so for some of us, we're not even interacting with that population at all. So when we interact with it, we're like, what is going on? Right. And so it's almost like you have no experience. So it is smart, if you're going to be working with these people, to have experience in dealing with them and understanding them. So there's a curiosity that I think has to happen. And most companies do not take the time to do that. We really just complain about them. And I'm saying it that way because it is, part of the general kind of like chatter we're having out there in the world about Gen Zs and Gen Zs in the workplace. So that's the first piece. The other piece of like what not to do is to like not give them clarity, number one, but then also not to give them too many specifics. Like a little bit of directionally accurate is sufficient, because if you're very specific with this population and give them like a very detailed job description, they're really going to come back to you and say, you told me to do these 5 things and I did them. And then your response is going to be like, well, the job description, flexes and da-da-da. And they're like, no, you put it on paper. Because again, they're of this generation where they're watching like a how-to TikTok video and they're following the instructions and they're doing it. So you have to actually kind of sit in that middle ground of somewhat like directionally accurate yet specific. And so thinking through your materials, the way you talk about roles, job descriptions specifically, create a lot of challenges, because it equals people feel like they're living up to what you're asking them to do, but then you're showing up and saying they're not, which is in itself a problem. Those are the places where you just want to start to be a little bit more sensitive to how they perceive information. And then the last piece is that you don't want to skip over not giving them recognition. We all have needs for recognition and appreciation. When I work with clients, this is one of the areas. I call it people's rhythms. We all have styles or processing, like cognitive ways that we process information. It runs the gamut from learning styles to communication styles to processing styles, but also to how we like to receive recognition and appreciation. And there's that great book, The 5 Love Languages, that many people have read at one point or another. And then I believe there's an adaptation for the workplace setting. But there are different ways that people want to receive recognition. Incentives and rewards are really important to Gen Zs. For me, for most of the millennials, just getting acknowledged and someone saying good job sort of like feeds your soul, and we're like over the moon. But that doesn't go the same length, and it doesn't hit in the same way for Gen Zs. They do need the incentives and rewards. They also don't really need the FaceTime. So if you're someone that was of the generation of a butt in a seat and like, I'm investing in you because I'm sitting with you, I'm here helping you out, it's not going to hit in the same way. It's going to feel more annoying. They also really need to be invested in. So acts of contribution make a difference for them. So making sure that they feel supported by things like coaching, retreats, workshops, conferences. Typically, these things are saved for more mid-level managers or senior people. But in the Gen Z world, they want to be a part of it. They want to be included. They care about community and being like enveloped in the space. So opening up those opportunities are all ways to make them feel recognized and appreciated.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I think you make such good points. And I think just even the generational comparison that, if I see 5 bullet points, like they really want to know, and they're not going to be shy in asking like, oh, which of these 5, or is it all the 5, or is it just the 2, or is it just there? So these are all very good points. Krista, what have you seen? Like, what are some of the best practices? Like, what companies come to mind, like in your consulting world, or even in your coaching world, as you see and talk to clients? Like, and you can name companies or not name companies, but just in terms of like, okay, what have you seen, which is sort of the new in thing, or the sort of very unique and creative ways in designing on board, if you have any stories or examples.
hmm I'm going to share. It's interesting because typically we think that more trendy, up and coming companies in industries and sectors that are sort of the moment do a good job. It's interesting because what I've noticed in the last few years is more of those antiquated industries are the ones that are really dealing with themselves and upgrading how they are onboarding people. So sectors like the insurance sector that has to be like overly competitive in this time and space are really thinking about how to onboard, how to create longevity. It's industries where people are retiring out soon and they haven't had a lot of like influx, so it hasn't been cool to work there. And so we've had people go towards tech and, you know, all the various tech, fintech, ad tech, all the things. So it's these industries that are a little bit more quote unquote boring that are really doing great jobs at recruiting for talent and like developing their culture and figuring out a way to retain talent because they're in a place where people are going to, for lack of a better word, age out soon and they're needing to replace their populations. So that's where I see that it's like being done well, which is a weird thing to say, but it's true. So those are the spaces. The places where it's really challenging for people are the industries that are constantly in flux. So retail spaces, which is where I grew up and still do a lot of work. So I saw a lot of coaching clients in that space and a consulting client as well. Any of the PR advertising spaces, that's constantly in flux. Media, as we know, has changed so much over the last few years. So that those are the ones that are really trying to figure it out. Um, and then also, I will say that the art space is really doing a good job at thinking about how to recruit and maintain Gen Zs.
Yeah. So does anything, I mean, stand out for you, or if you know, because I which you can think that, wow, that that's a little funky, or that's really sort of kind of out of the norm. And I'm trying to think from my own experience, because like a few years ago we used to do work for Microsoft, because they were a big center in India, and um, they used to literally take, like, I think they used to hire like a huge amount, and I don't know, maybe just a few years ago. Obviously, they've gone through a cycle. Like, they used to take them to a rock concert, like immediately after induction or something, shortly after, like in Seattle. And these are all freshers, like fresh engineers, or people who are in different roles, of course. Something really, really like so, and everybody could talk to that, like, and they would fly. I don't know, people from all over the world. So this is something that, do you have an anecdote, or like where they say, hey, okay, we're gonna do the Mount Everest base camp or something. I don't know. I'm just saying that, okay, anything that you think is very creative. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a specific anecdote, but I used to do some work with Live Nation and Ticketmaster, and obviously that they're putting on crazy concerts and like interesting performances. They're managing talent, and so they always did interesting like inductions, if you will, like ways to get people to really be a part of the brand. And their organization was very interesting because their model was more of a hub and spoke. They had acquired different companies in different spaces over time, so they didn't operate as like a central culture necessarily, although they did have like cultural tenets. They really wanted people to have an entrepreneurial sort of spirit and like run their own business. And so it becomes complex. Like a big organization like Microsoft, you're either going to have a company that has a very clear and structured corporate culture, or one that, because we've acquired businesses or we've gone into territories over time, we're letting people just be who they are in their own particular settings, but then we bring them together and connect them to this one sort of like value of who we are. And so what I notice, it's more about that. It's about the value that we have is disruption. So we're going to do things that actually disrupt or are weird or interesting or awkward in our like cultural moments. So it could be like bringing in a really interesting kind of off the cuff speaker. It could be doing, like you said, bringing them to like a cool concert in Seattle and having everybody rock out. So I think every company does a little bit differently, but what it connects to is the value that they're trying to really instill, especially if they're a large organization.
So, a lot of the things, when you think about, for example, even compensation benefits, the trend is going towards how do we personalize that for, a multi-generation workforce. Like, so maybe if there's people in Generation X or let's say Gen Y, they all kind of have different, sort of milestones of life of where they are and what they wish to do as the next thing, right? So maybe for one generation, it's more about how do I become better with my retirement and the next life after that. And for the others is for the Gen Zs, more like, okay, how do I and start thinking about saving? So in onboarding, have you seen or is there a trend or do you see that maybe personalization or onboarding can happen? So if I'm not recruiting a mass number in one go, and let's say I hire a salesperson who's going to be very different than I'm hiring, let's say, an engineer who's going to sit in the back and just work in an office. But the sales guy, yeah. So what have you seen, and is that kind of happening?
So I have not seen too much of a generational piece. And the reason why I feel that's the case, and I actually think it's misguided inside of organizations, is because we spent a lot of time, especially in the US in the last few years, really dismantling our DEI programs and kind of walking away from that. And I have a personal frustration with this across the board because DEI programs were about thinking about all the various ways to make different populations feel included and having policies and processes inside of companies that allowed us to thrive with all of our differences. And so one of the main differences that we're experiencing across the board, across countries, is like the multigenerational workforce. And there is very, very little training that goes on in terms of how to work with people. And also the challenge becomes that a lot of the people who are coming in to build out these programs are younger. They're in their 30s, millennials, like young millennials or later millennials like me. So it really starts to become a problem because we always craft from our own lens and we always do things that are most comfortable to us. And so then we start to feel frustrated because there isn't the give back, right? Or the ROI that we expected to see. So for me, I think it's a conversation and also matters as it pertains to Gen Zs because they actually do care about DEI policies. They care about having inclusion. They want to have ERGs. There's another takeaway to give to everybody, building community within the Gen Z space is really important. If they don't have a sense of community, it doesn't have to just be their own community because Gen Zs actually have a love and nostalgia for like the older people, if you will. And they actually do have many friends that come from different ages and backgrounds. So thinking about how to build community is really important. But I digress. My point in what I was saying is that thinking through, like, do you have a robust DEI sort of perspective inside your company and thinking about that from the cross-generational lens and really providing training and development and even just a willingness to educate yourself will make a big difference because it is missing in how we think about onboarding, retention, but also sort of like the experience as we move people through, right? Because what ends up happening is that the older we get in our careers, we want to become more advisors, right? We want to impart our wisdom. And so for somebody that's been an individual contributor inside of an organization for so long, like they might be doing a function they've done forever, they can do it really well, but they want to be leveraged in a different way. So how do we create that opportunity? With a Gen Z person, they want to do their job, but they also want like experience. They want exposure. So how do we make that happen? But again, it's about being sensitive and like understanding that there is a difference and having a core value internally that says like, we do care about DEI because it's more than just race or gender. It's like more of an inclusive, holistic look at the varying needs of the populations that we actually need to have happy and productive so we can get work done. And that's been a lot of money on attrition. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. So couple of final questions here, Krista. I think, just as a way to close out, it's very, very fascinating. I think it's been a great conversation. I just to hear and hopefully our listeners can really kind of see the importance of onboarding and the kind of the do's and don'ts. Now, one way to just as a way to close out, like what should the manager, right? So let's say if I'm coming in, what should the manager do or and not do to make that experience good. So let's say, so that's the first part of the question. Like, okay, if I'm a manager, what can I do to make it sticky? That's one. And also, just as a way to close, is also to say that, okay, what can the Gen Z do, right? It's not always about the company and the manager and the boss and everything. I mean, yeah, you're welcoming somebody, but can we also kind of say that, okay, maybe they need to be a little flexible and adapt. And it's a long career of 30, 40, 50 years, right? So you're not, you have to kind of make an opinion about life and make an opinion about your work career as you progress through it, right? So in other words, what can they should be mindful as well when they're onboarding. So one is the kind of the do don't from the manager's perspective, and kind of do don't from the Gen Z.
Yes. So this is one of my most passionate topics that I love to talk about. So I appreciate the question. I have, like I mentioned, been doing this for a very long time. And in my both personal career and then in the coaching and the consulting that I do, I've noticed that we end up misdiagnosing problems, quote unquote. And what ends up happening inside of an organization is that we look for someone that can do the job, right? They have the skills and the willingness. So like their performance, can they do it? And then we look for somebody who's a good culture fit on some level, right? And so I call that people's essence, like their personality, their reputation that they build, the behaviors that they have, etc. And when something goes awry, we typically go to they either can't do the job, like they don't have the skills, or they need to be trained, or they're not willing to do the job, like they're lazy or whatever it might be, or they're not flexible enough, which can be true. People may not be flexible, and we have to deal with that. If an employee is not flexible and they really are rigid, and that is the truth, they probably should be coached out of the business, because you cannot develop people who are not flexible. And that's just the truth for anybody. And it is a sign of fitness, right? Even in your physical body, the more flexible you are, the less likely you're going to get hurt, right? The stronger you will be, the longer you're going to live. So it's an important component to test for, especially when you're interviewing people for the like health and wellness of your organization. So there's performance. Then there is the personality. So when something doesn't go right, we go, okay, well, they just can't do the job, or they don't want to, or whatever. Or we say, you know what, they're just not a good culture fit. Or we just say, but the personality is off, right? And that is only one part of the occasion. The reality is that there's another component that creates a lot of friction inside companies that we spend no time talking about at all. We do a lot of personality tests, and we do all these things that I think are wonderful. I love them. This is my profession. I do them all the time with my clients. I do them on myself. They provide insight, but it's not enough. There is the other world of people's, as I mentioned earlier, their rhythms, right? How they work, their processing styles, their learning styles, their recognition styles, their decision-making approaches, their how they like to deal with emotions, how far they swing when you give them feedback, and how quickly they come back to their baseline. All these things matter. And when you're not present to what people's rhythms are, and if their rhythms are different from yours, it will cause friction and you will have attrition. So the answer to your question is really take the time to get to know your people. Every manager must really understand, well, how is my person wired? How they like to work? And where are the natural places where we're going to have friction? And I always joke with people, I'm somebody that learns by talking and listening. It's not a shock for what I do for work. If you send me an email, I do not understand what you wrote in an email. I will call you about it, and I will annoy you because you just spent 20 minutes writing me this beautiful email. And I'm like, do you have 5 minutes? And you're irritated. And so that creates a friction point for people. If I don't know how to own that and explain, this is how I learn, and can you help me here? You're going to think I'm obnoxious, I'm not working independently, I'm taking up too much of your time, and all of a sudden I'm a problem child. When actually we just have a learning difference together. And you like to write it down, I need to talk about it. So how do we balance that out? And being smart about it, diagnosing the problems appropriately and calling them what they are. They're not problems. They're natural differences that, again, go back to that larger DEI context that I mentioned. So I can stay on that soapbox for hours. I will get off of it now, but that is the number one thing I see. The Gen Z,
from the Gen Z perspective.
Yes, the Gen Z's answer to it is a long time ago. I'm a professional development, work development junkie. But a long time ago, I read this book called The First 90 Days. the first 100 days. I can't remember what the words were, but it was basically what you should do in the first 90 or 100 days of your job. And in it, it creates a blueprint for making sure you have the appropriate conversations with people. And I recommend this book to people all the time, especially when they're starting off in their career. But why I think it's important for Gen Zs is oftentimes they sit and wait for people to tell them what to do, or they will do just what they are told. And then they'll go, see, I did it. And it's fair because, again, of how we've trained them and their experience, but it's not going to work inside of a company. So setting the expectation very early on, or for any Gen Zs that are listening to this, to have your own blueprint for how you're going to go build relationships, how you're going to go ask for feedback, and how you're going to invest in your own learning and ask for what you need to get to where you want to go, and not sitting around and waiting for the moments to come to you. And I think that's a very important expectation that companies can set at the beginning, but also it is something that as people who are working with Gen Zs, as colleagues or mentors or allies or advocates, that we're subtly influencing in our interactions, because it will help them grow. It'll also take down a lot of those friction points that we talked about earlier, and it'll just make them better employees overall.
Yeah. No, wow, it's fabulous. I really like, Chris, the advice from the manager's perspective. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to have a pulse of what is going on with your group, with your people, and certainly as an immediate boss, but even more generally, if you're just leading people. So it sounds the very obvious, but hopefully, in an onboarding experience, right, the manager is there telling the stories, and sharing the values of who they are, right? So I really like that. But I even like, as much as you talked on the Gen Z side, that look, it isn't about just coming and doing the task. I really, really want to underscore that, for the simple reason, because in many cultures, and as also you mentioned that go out and ask for help, and the advice of building relationships and asking for learning, because I think in many cultures, like in Asia, for example, it's more about like, look, I've got to do what my boss asks me to do. And therefore, I think it's very important to be proactive about that, and kind of adapt and learn. So fabulous. And I think this has been one great conversation. I've learned a lot. Certainly, it's been many years since the onboarding happened for me, but just to get an idea of what companies are going through and what we need to be aware of. So, Chris, as a way to close out, you obviously do very good work in many different areas. Where can people find you? Are there any links, website, and on what you do, and how can they reach you?
Oh, wonderful. Yes. So I think we'll provide the links in the notes. But if you are interested in the consultancy work that I do and the gamut that runs, you can find that information at CZB Consultancy. And if you're interested in my personal work, speaking, some other engagements that I do, podcasts, articles, writing, that's at chrisazboyce.com.
Okay, well, check it out. We will certainly have all of that information available as part of the guest credentials, and also certainly LinkedIn is there. So, Krista, thank you once again, and I hope that if your travels ever bring you to Asia and in India, hopefully we can do an in-person meeting, right? And
Love.
yeah, and certainly I'm due to travel in the US in the upcoming year. So thank you once again. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I think this is one episode has kind of taken some time, but I'm glad it's happened, because it's such a crucial and important one for the Gen Z coming on board, and what they need to be kind of aware of, and the managers in the companies. So thank you once again. I wish you a good day, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.